Hello, you are listening to the Animalia Hour on KGVM. We are a podcast based in Bozeman, Montana, committed to environmentalism, human health, and redefining our relationship to other animals. We hope through this podcast to inspire you to live vegan for the same reasons. I'm Kevin.
I'm Lucy.
And I'm Sarah. Hi, everybody. And welcome back to our show. We're glad you're here. Today, we are doing part 2 of a 2-episode series, I guess, on an essay titled Animals' Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress. And this essay was written originally in 1892. The edition we're looking at is the 1922 reprint. So yeah, if you're interested, please do go back and catch the first episode where we kind of introduced this essay and we went through the introduction and the first, I guess, 2 chapters. Today we have a challenge on the table to get through the rest of the essay in this 1 hour. So we're determined to do that.
I think we can do it.
Yeah. Now, last week we were marveling at this author, Henry S. Salt, spelled S-A-L-T, like the mineral, for being so revolutionary. As you read through this essay, it feels very contemporary. It feels very current. It feels even revolutionary, even by today's standards, right? So it's just amazing that this person back in 1892 was thinking this way, writing this way. And Lucy pointed out that he was a contemporary and even a friend of Gandhi. And so that connection kind of starts to help explain, I think, the streams he was swimming in or whatever. I think they were both members of the, what was it?
Vegetarian Society in the UK.
Yeah, in London.
Gandhi didn't make him vegetarian, but they were kind of like in the same stream at the same time kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He actually, the essay of a plea, I think it's A Plea for Vegetarianism, the essay by Salt, inspired Gandhi to study vegetarianism a little bit more. I'm not sure if he was already vegetarian or not. Probably was.
Yeah, it was the London Vegetarian Society. They had a social meeting on November 20th, 1931. There's a picture online. You can see both of them in the picture. But 500 people attended. That's crazy, right? Yeah. If you think about it, at least 500
cool.
people.
All of the vegetarians of England.
Were there at that meeting. That's crazy.
Yeah.
For 1931, that's remarkable.
Yeah, and it makes me start to wonder. It makes me curious if London or if the UK's colonization of places like India, definitely had some influence on the British culture.
Possibly.
And, coming in close contact with more of the Dharma traditions that view animals a little bit differently than Westerners typically do.
And also, like his father was a colonist. Actually, he was born in India, Salt, and then they relocated to the UK when he was an infant. So probably his parents had some culture exchanges like this.
Sure.
Yeah, very cool. So we're gonna dive right in to the 3rd chapter. So the first one was just kind of laying the groundwork philosophically for the idea of do animals have rights, and kind of like he kind of builds it on, if humans have inalienable rights, can we argue that animals do as well, and why or why not? And then the next chapter was about domestic animals, so we discussed that last week. The 3rd chapter is the case of wild animals. So this is definitely getting into, it's summertime, at least here in our hemisphere. And, a lot of families will pay money to go to zoos or aquariums, SeaWorld, circuses. I guess those are kind of like a year-round thing. But, fairs and carnivals. People are tourists this time of year, especially. And you can go places and pay to ride on camels or to ride on elephants or to ride donkeys in the Grand Canyon, or so some of that would apply to this chapter, the idea that animals are used, wild animals are used a lot of times for entertainment in our culture. He starts out the chapter, this quote jumped out at me. It says, "Everywhere it has been well said," so quote, "everywhere," unquote, "it has been well said, it is absolutely a capital crime to be an unowned creature." And what he's saying there is, during his time, there was finally some laws on the books for domesticated animals. So if an animal was your quote unquote property, it could be protected under the law. And there were penalties for being cruel to domesticated animals or animals that were in your captivity. But if you were not property, somebody's property, those animals had no protection. And it reminds me also of a quote I've heard where someone said, "For animals, this world is hell." Like, they are completely at our mercy.
Wow.
Like, we as humans have, we could treat them with impunity, we could do whatever we want. And so if you think about the fear that would create within animals, that, just the fact that they are dependent on us to leave them alone. They're dependent on us to be kind.
Yeah, and I mean that idea just even rings true for me. Like, if you thought about you as a person, just think about all of us and how we live our lives and the freedoms we have. And a lot of times we have to go to work, and we might not feel like going to work, especially if it's a job we don't necessarily, it's maybe not in line with our livelihood. And some people are lucky enough that they get to do a job that they really enjoy. Many people probably do not. And it's funny when your boss or somebody tells you to go do something and you don't really feel like it, you still have to just go do it. And yet, how that feels? Can you imagine being essentially a slave and getting beaten and being uncomfortable? And this book also brought up the idea when they're transported, and we'll probably get into that. But can you imagine not even having a comfort, not being able to sit down or lie down because you're so jammed into a train car or a truck car, and you for hours you're just,
or days,
you cannot just have normal creature comforts that we all have, and I think we all take it for granted many times.
In a lot of cases, no protection whatsoever.
No protection, right. And it's just, I don't know, this book really brought that to life for me. Like, if we really if we tried to be empathetic and put ourselves into the place of these animals, we might find what's happening to them to be completely atrocious.
To me, when you start to do that practice of putting yourself in the shoes of the animal, it really starts to look like all the the most horrible periods of history for humans, all that we've experienced, like slavery, things like that, were things that, when you look at it, are very much going on for the animals at this moment. It's very similar, extremely similar actually, and it shows you that what we see as we're so lucky not to have lived through that.
Right.
It was the worst periods of history ever, things like that. This is what the animals are going through right now.
Every day. No, I know. And I think this book really helps me understand. I don't want to go too far down that road, but just the idea that, we might have a mild case of, being indisposed to go do something we don't want to do. And yet these animals are living a life of not being free, of not doing what they want to do,
and
tortured and being uncomfortable and living in feces and urine and all these other things. So anyway,
yeah. And I mean, I do appreciate that, you brought up the idea that, especially when you go see animals who are performing or doing tricks, you could think of Lion, what was that? The Tiger King?
Tiger King on the Netflix.
Where he had captive wild cats and was forcing them to do tricks. Or you go to SeaWorld and you see the marine life doing tricks for the trainers, or circuses. The only way they can get those animals to do those tricks on command a lot of times is through beating them or withholding food or frightening them. So
Well, and misusing the whole concept of dominion and being almost a tyrant. And I got to be honest with you, this brings up from
Literally.
yeah, literally, but this brings up for me even these backyard like wild uh zoos, whatever, exotic pet
Hmm.
worlds that not even like a full-fledged like like the Cincinnati Zoo, one of the most famous
A
zoos in the
petting
United States,
zoo.
like a petting zoo, but like wild animals,
Yeah.
like not far from us, maybe 15 miles down the highway is the Grizzly Bear Discovery Center, things like that. I mean, I just want to say, like, even the Tiger King you mentioned, one of his workers lost a right. She lost a hand, right? A tiger had eaten her hand, and yet that's what happens in these backyard zoos. And I mean, there was a whole special on Netflix that was just this B movie documentary, but it was all these examples of all these backyard little exotic pet places where people get injured because
Yeah, we forget that they're
yeah,
predators.
they're wild animals,
Much
and
stronger than us.
exactly. And if you turn your back, they're going to be on you. And people are careless, and they don't really understand what they're getting into. And maybe we shouldn't be holding these animals in captivity.
Right. So he talks about how we love to justify having animals in captivity, that somehow these animals don't have to worry about, predators. And so they can relax and things like that. But he really refutes that pretty powerfully and says that, for all we know, a speedy death would be preferable to being imprisoned in a tiny little space, and then not being allowed to just be who they are out in nature. And there's a quote here: to take a wild animal from its free natural state, full of abounding egoism and vitality, and to shut it up for the wretched remainder of its life in a cell where it has just space to turn around and where it necessarily loses every distinctive feature of its character. This appears to me to be as downright a denial as could well be imagined of the theory of animals' rights. That reminds me, too, of that book, The Octopus Soul, that talks about octopuses, and all of the octopuses in that book are studied in captivity. And the keepers of the octopuses will spend many, many hours just trying to come up with games and puzzles for the octopus to work on, because they realize that this animal is so intelligent, and keeping them in captivity, they are so bored that it's, they describe it as cruel and inhumane to not give this octopus something to do with their mind.
Right.
And so, but I don't think it's just octopuses. I think it's really any animal you take away. Remember, we talked about the three basic human rights that we all pretty much agree on, which is life, liberty, or freedom, and the ability to pursue happiness. When we take away an animal's freedom, just so that we can enjoy looking at it, we could pay money to go look at it, we're denying them that basic right of freedom. I mean, he talks about zoos, which, I think of as animal prisons. He talks about caged birds, which I think is going out of vogue. I don't think there's as many people keeping birds in cages as maybe, a few decades ago. And there's this nice quote here, kind of at the end of the chapter. If we desire to cultivate a closer intimacy with the wild animals, it must be an intimacy based on a genuine love for them as living beings and fellow creatures, not on the superior power or cunning by which we can drag them from their native haunts, warp the whole purpose of their lives, and degrade them to the level of pets or curiosities or captives.
And he talks a lot about how people like justify zoos, for example, as because it's educational. But he argues that basically how educational can it be to observe these animals in captivity when they're not actually living their natural lives and
Right.
having their natural behaviors?
Right.
You know?
No, exactly. It's almost like when an anthropologist shows up to some village somewhere, like there is this influence, there is an influence of being watched. And it's ironic because it also reminds me of around here, if you go to Yellowstone National Park or anywhere and you actually see a live grizzly bear in the park or cross your path on the road, you think it's amazing. But if you were to go see a grizzly bear in captivity, you'd be like, okay.
Yeah.
It's cool, but
exactly,
I
because
mean,
it's
it's
not who they are. Like they're not.
Yeah.
They cannot be who they are.
it's way more exciting to see it out in the wild.
Yeah.
You know, grizzly
Because
bear.
otherwise, at the zoo, you're just looking at how they look like.
Right.
And I mean, no less heartbreaking. I'm not trying to rank with the most heartbreaking one, but yeah, I mean, when I think about, the orcas, who naturally, literally swim the length of the globe. They go from the very northernmost parts of the globe to the most southernmost parts of the globe every year, naturally. And then they're at places like SeaWorld, they're literally put in this pool. It's like basically like, putting an animal in a bathtub for the rest of their life. And they're there for decades.
Right.
They're kidnapped and brought into captivity, and they're there just swimming in circles for decades.
Right.
Yeah, prisons for the
Right.
innocent.
There's a really good documentary on Netflix about them called Blackfish, if you ever want to check it out. And also, there's this thing where their fins, kind of their top fin, their dorsal fin, kind of bends over the top of it when they're in captivity. And they make all these justifications, like it's the lack of exercise and or, collagen development because they don't get to roam so far. And so that could be the case. I mean, sometimes I think it's just depression, because I think on Blackfish, when they let one of these orcas, when they let it free, almost immediately its top fin, its dorsal fin went straight. And so, that might not speak to a collagen problem. That might speak to a depression problem. But
yeah, so maybe we need to consider not patronizing these types of establishments that are using captive animals for entertainment.
And also, like, around here, rodeo is very much in vogue, I guess. These are not wild animals, obviously. They are bred like in, I don't know actually how, in the food industry, or is it, I don't know. Anyways, doesn't really matter. They are bred like, it's still the same thing though. Still used for entertainment, and
right.
And there's a lot of abuse going on, obviously.
Oh, there is a lot of abuse. Even we can go into that in detail if we wanted to, but
in another show.
Yeah, but yeah, absolutely.
So moving on to chapter 4, this is the chapter about the slaughter of animals for food. The most striking thing to me about this chapter was how almost point for point, it's exactly the same arguments that we're having with people today. Namely, he starts out just by saying at one time maybe this was necessary for human survival, but it is no longer necessary. We do not need to be eating animals to survive as a species. And then he goes right into the circle of life argument, which is still what comes up with us today, that basically this is the way the world works. It's a survival of the fittest. The strong prey on the weak, and it's just the way it is. And he says, the analogy contended for is extremely lame, since animals have no power to support life by any other means. And since we have, for the whole human species might subsist entirely upon fruit, pulse, herbs, and roots, as many tribes of Hindus actually do. He goes into human anatomy. So again, this is an argument we get all the time. Like, oh, look at our canines. We're created to be carnivores. And he says comparative anatomy has shown that man is not carnivorous, but frugivorous in his natural structure. Experience has shown that flesh food is wholly unnecessary for the support of healthy life. He talks about the transit and slaughter of animals that is atrociously cruel. He kind of says exactly what people know that Paul McCartney has said, whereas he goes into how slaughter is kept out of sight, out of mind. It's not polite to bring it up in polite society. It's kind of considered bad manners, which we experience as vegans. Like as soon as you start talking about this in polite company, people look at you like you're some kind of gauche, uncouth person, because it's intentionally kept secret.
Right. And I also think the essence of this chapter, which I thought was very interesting, is that there was a lot of private slaughterhouses happening at this time in like roughly 1892, 1900s. And he was saying, hey, at least if we're going to do this, not that we should be doing it, but if we're going to do this, let's regulate it. Maybe we should make public slaughterhouses to try and provide some more humane means of slaughtering these animals. So that's an interesting argument, right? And now we know killing is killing. There's no real
and since
humane
it's unnecessary,
killing.
there's no justification. I think also the point that he was bringing was that especially in transition, when we're transitioning as a society, there's still going to be people who are going to do it, pay for it before it's illegal or something like that. And so in the process, in the best interest of the animals, at least,
Right.
It's like if you're going to kill someone, but you shouldn't kill them, but,
Right. No, 100%.
And I think we're going to be doing a show in the near future on slaughterhouses and the people who end up working at those places. He talks about how, going back to how it's kept carefully out of sight and out of mind, the work is delegated to a pariah class who do the work which most educated persons would shrink from doing for themselves.
Right.
He talks about how unsanitary it is. And there again, if people could see how unsanitary it is and what a public health concern it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is always funny to me. Yeah, because if you ever run into any of your friends who are not vegan and you try to give them a Beyond Beef burger, they start to look at the ingredients like it's a bunch of fake ingredients, like, chemicals and things. Well, if you really know what was going on in a slaughterhouse.
And you look at the ingredients of the meat.
Oh,
you don't
exactly.
see the antibiotics on the box. You don't see so many, like the hormones, natural hormones, the unnatural hormones.
All these things.
There's the medications.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And one little final point in this chapter I thought was very interesting. There's a quote here. He says, and by the way, this is written in 1892. We're reading the 1922 edition. He says, 50 or 100 years ago, there was perhaps some excuse for supporting that vegetarianism was a mere fad. There is absolutely no such excuse at the present time. So isn't that crazy?
We're still in the fat. We've been in the fat for so long, people.
I think that's so funny. So
a century or something.
Yeah, and I guess one more thing, like in terms of, we love to believe that animals who go to slaughterhouses are killed in the most humane way possible. Humanely slaughtered is actually a phrase. And like Ed Winters has said, if you believe that what goes on in a slaughterhouse is so humane for the animals, why don't we send our pets to be euthanized at slaughterhouses? And I think that it does shed an immediate light on the subject that actually, no, I would not want my pet to go to a slaughterhouse.
Why is that?
So we have arrived at chapter 5, titled Sport, or Amateur Butchery. And I feel like this definitely strikes a chord, maybe, especially in our context, being here in Bozeman, Montana, recording this. It's definitely a part of our culture here to engage in sport. And I guess that's a word we use for hunting, fishing. Yeah, basically going out there and killing animals.
I thought you were going to put sport in air quotes. Sport, air quotes.
Yeah.
Basically hunting, fishing, yeah.
Yeah, and Salt, he does not pull any punches in this chapter. He's pretty forceful.
Yes.
In his distaste for this phenomenon of sport. So yeah, Salt has lots of strong words for hunters. And he's kind of just going from the premise of, for us to actually derive pleasure from the suffering and mutilation and torture and murder of innocent, defenseless animals is, if you think about it, it's a little psychopathic. It's a little
sadistic.
Yeah.
Right. And he even gets into really quickly the argument of necessity. There is no necessity. So this is completely for our own amusement.
Yeah, he says, but to seek one's own amusement out of the death pangs of other beings, this is saddening stupidity indeed. So he comes up, once again, feels very contemporary. He comes up right up against the argument of masculinity. He says, it is often said that the manliness of our national character would be injuriously affected by the discontinuance of these sports. A strange argument when one considers the very unequal and therefore unmanly conditions of the strife. Thoughts?
Well,
Oh, is masculinity attacking the defenseless or protecting them?
right. No, I know. A lot of times you find that the strongest men in the world are actually the biggest protectors. There's some strength in actually holding back your power and not unleashing it.
So I think the argument would
Yeah.
be, I am protecting my wife and children by securing food for them, right? Which, it's hard to take that argument seriously in terms of how much money did you spend on your equipment to go
Right.
out there and do this?
No,
And is
sport?
it even necessary?
Oh, I
Right,
think of that
Yeah.
all the time. I mean, all of the equipment, the bows, the uniform, the gear, the scopes, the duck blinds, all of the things, the backpacks. There's so much money spent on actually going out and taking a risk that you might actually get to shoot an animal. And then you want to make an argument that, oh, well, this is cheaper than me going to the store and buying.
And there's the accident factor involved. Like,
100%.
some people get shot.
Not only that,
You know?
some people hunt in grizzly bear territory, and sometimes they're fighting, or they're competing with grizzly bears for the carcass.
So, yeah, I think what was really nicely said, what you said earlier, both of you actually, that, when it comes to being a manly man, we think of they protect the elderly, they protect the children, they protect people, they protect those who need protecting. But for some reason, when it comes to an innocent animal that's never done anything to hurt anybody and cannot fight back, cannot protect itself, for some reason it's manly to go in and kill that animal with
Especially unnecessarily.
unnecessarily.
Right.
And it's not a fair fight. You're going in with a high-powered rifle against an animal that has no ability
Weapon,
to...
Or a high-powered bow. I mean,
Yeah.
the technology in compound bows these days is unbelievable. The pressure, the poundage. Interesting you say that, because here's a quote from a French historian. His name is Jules Michelet. Here's a quote from Michelet. "Woe to the ungrateful," says Michelet. "By this phrase I mean the sporting crowd, who, unmindful of the numerous benefits we owe to the animals, exterminate innocent life. A terrible sentence weighs on the tribes of sportsmen. They can create nothing. They originate no art, no industry. It is a shocking and hideous thing to see a child partial to sport, to see women enjoying and admiring murder and encouraging her child. The delicate and sensitive woman would not give him a knife, but she gives him a gun."
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty powerful. I mean, these guys. This was back in the 1800s. I mean, these are some strong words.
Yeah, it reminds me of, again,
It's
this...
very impressive to me.
Yeah. And this culture of masculinity and this idea that this is just kind of what we do and it's fun and it's wholesome and it's good. I remember someone confronting you, Kevin, a few years ago, like a family man. We were actually at a holiday dinner with another family, and he when he found out that you didn't take our kids hunting and you didn't take our kids fishing, he basically said, what kind of father are you?
Right.
And you're robbing your children
Yep.
of this experience, and it's like, okay, yes, of course it's really good to go out into nature with your kids and spend time with them and get to know them and teach them about the world and teach them about nature. But why does it have to involve the killing of defenseless
Right.
animals?
Well, there's so many things you can do out in nature. You can carve
Hike.
pieces of wood. You can hike. You can forage for food.
Can learn survival skills that do not involve
Absolutely.
the harm of
No,
animals.
you can practice all kinds of craftsmanship.
Yeah, camping.
You can identify the plant life. You can identify the bird life, the animal life.
Absolutely.
You can identify, we have a friend who's a geologist. When she goes hiking, she's always identifying all the rocks in the
Right.
area.
There's just so much. And there are all these books around Montana that you can buy. The geology of Montana, the birds of Montana, the mushrooms of Montana.
Yeah, and water sports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these things. So, and it's always interesting to me too. I have to just throw this in here that when we talk about birding, when we talk about birding, we're just talking about taking some binoculars and going out and watching birds and identifying them. And that's the sport of birding. If you want to call it a sport, what would you call it? Would you call it a sport?
I think so.
But yet when we talk about fishing,
Yeah.
we're not going out and watching fish. We're going out and hooking them in the mouths. And how would that feel if you got a hook in your mouth? But anyway, I was thinking one thing we should try to do possibly is redefine the term fishing. So that maybe somebody sits by a stream and just watches fish swimming in the rivers. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, like a lot of people, like a lot of people believe that fish don't feel pain, but it's been proven by science now. Like it's a consensus that fish feel pain.
Absolutely.
So like the thing of like catching them, releasing them, like as if it's kind of a favor to give them, like to catch them and then release them. It does hurt them.
Well, of course it does.
They feel it.
You're injuring them and you're throwing them back to let them suffer and heal.
So I think that's a really nice segue right into this whole concept of conservationism, the idea of because the whole catch and release phenomenon of not overfishing or so he addresses that as well, that we preserve animals so that they continue to exist for our pleasure, to go out and continue to fish them, continue to hunt them. So we're not really preserving them in any kind of compassionate way or a way that's interested in their well-being necessarily. It's all about, will they continue to survive as a species so that we can continue?
No, absolutely. Conservation, we like to use the word conservation in the United States. It really has nothing to do with the welfare of the animals. It's the conservation of the sport.
Yeah, and because we're attached to hunting these types of animals, especially and stuff like that. But like also saying that if we don't control the population or whatever, it's not, they're not gonna survive in nature. And then it's like thinking, well, if the importance is about the ecosystem being balanced, etc., wouldn't you let the species that wouldn't survive just go extinct?
Right.
Because like if you let nature do its thing, it's gonna happen in some ways.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
well, and that's the thing too, is and like you just said, Mother Nature can take care of herself. She really doesn't need our help in so many ways.
It's playing God, in a
absolutely.
sense.
But what's also interesting, if you really are concerned about conservation, then maybe you wouldn't support factory farms, because nothing destroys ecosystems and species and land that wild animals use, and that would be in the rainforest, that would be here in Montana, is the spreading of land for ranching.
Yes.
Right? Is knocking down trees
and
so
for
we can,
the crops used for the feed of the animals.
Absolutely. So if you really cared about conservation, if you really cared, you would not eat hamburgers or meat.
So he quotes this person named Soame Jenis, written in 1782. He says, "What name would we bestow," said a humane essayist of the 18th century, "on a superior being?" So he's talking in this situation, like what would we call a superior being, like an alien race, who, without provocation or advantage, should continue from day to day, void of all pity and remorse, to torment mankind for diversion, and at the same time endeavor with the utmost care to preserve their lives and to promulgate their species in order to increase the number of victims devoted to his malevolence. And he delighted in proportion to the miseries which he occasioned. I say, what name detestable enough could we find for such a being? Yet, if we impartially consider the case and our intermediate situation, we must acknowledge that with regard to the inferior animals, just such a being is the sportsman. So
Very
this idea that we're keeping them alive just so that we can mess with them, kill them for our diversion, our pleasure.
It's pretty cruel.
Talking about earlier, we're talking about, conservation. Also something that people talk about is invasive species. And I find that a very interesting concept, because when you look at it objectively on Earth, who's the most invasive species in terms of destruction? Humans.
There you go.
We destroy the most. And would you ever consider shooting, hunting humans? No, because we have rights. And that's the difference between us and animals. They don't have rights. They're not considered as individuals having rights, right? And that's something to consider. Like, are they more invasive than us? No.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And they were here first, usually.
Yeah.
And also we go into their land and we say, there's too much, there's
Yeah.
too many of you.
They're a
Right.
pest. We need to get rid of
No,
them.
around here,
Yeah,
exactly. We complain about, ranchers complain about gophers. Well, let's see. Who was here first? The gophers or the cattle?
Chapter 6, Murderous, Millinery. What in the world is millinery?
Yeah.
So this chapter ends up being basically about animals used in fashion. And during Salt's time, he's referring to millinery, which is ladies' hats, the ladies' hat industry, which obviously is not much of an issue today. But during his time, again, the late early 1900s, women were wearing and collecting and buying several hats per person, probably, that were made primarily of or decorated with exotic bird feathers. And so it had become quite the industry. He has a quote kind of in the middle of the chapter of, thousands and thousands and thousands of different species of birds being shipped to different milliners to make these hats, to the point where birds were going extinct or becoming endangered. So that doesn't really apply, I guess, as much in our context.
There's still use of feathers, right?
That's
Especially
probably
for
true.
crafts and things like that.
Well, also for coats, right?
Yeah, and
Down
costumes.
Okay, yeah.
feathers.
I mean, yeah. I
Down
guess.
feathers are used quite often
Yeah.
Yeah.
for coats and things. But in terms of a spectacle or like
Yeah, it's a different
ornamentation,
way.
we're not making these fancy hats
Yeah.
out of ornamented feathers and things, but
I guess a little. Not as
Yeah.
much,
I suppose.
Yeah. So, and I think even the wearing of furs has, I believe, decreased over the past.
I'm not
few
actually
centuries.
sure because of the number of people now being able to buy. Like, there's actually a lot of furs real fur in normal fashion.
Yeah.
So I'm not actually sure because now there's even more people that are able to afford these things.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not even sure about that.
It's a good point.
I mean, it's definitely still, in my experience, I would say it's definitely still a status
Yeah.
symbol. Like when I have been around in different jobs I've held, when I have been around the very affluent, you will see them come in furs, unfortunately. So it's still a thing, but yeah, we could definitely talk about the leather industry. And interesting to note, like on the first page of this chapter, he says it was found that vegetable leather could be successfully employed in boot making. So way
Wow.
back in 1892,
That is crazy.
people were exploring the idea of vegetable leather, which I thought was like in my lifetime, in just in the past decade or two, that people were starting to experiment with mushroom leather and cactus leather.
Right.
And
No, that's funny you say that because I have a belt made out of cactus and it's pretty awesome. It's pretty durable. And you're right. I thought that was a new thing.
yeah,
Probably more
And-
sustainable. I mean, it is more sustainable. Actually,
It
for
is,
sure.
but the fact
Yeah.
that over 100 years ago, they were already experimenting with vegetable leather.
Just like the things we find out, like, the plant milks, a lot of people think plant milks are new, but they've been around for centuries in Asia, for example.
mm-hmm.
Coconut milk, almond milk, oat
Sure.
milk, all these things.
Soy milk, yeah. And he makes the point of saying, we should not be blaming the suppliers of these fashion items as much as we blame the consumers, which I don't know. I could go either way because a lot of times consumers buy these products without having any idea where they came from or who had to die for their production, whereas the producers know exactly where they're coming from and how much suffering was involved. But it is something to think about. The consumer is responsible for what they are financing with their shopping dollar.
100%.
And,
and I mean, if like it's harder to stop an industry, especially in this society that works like in a capitalist way, right?
Right.
I'm not judging whether it's good or not. It's just that it just works like that. If there's less of a demand, it's just gonna go out of business. That's how it
Right.
works, right? I mean, of course, you can talk about subsidies too, but
Right. But think about, because right now we might think, well, we're not making these very ornamental hats made out of feathers and things, but many people, women especially, are using mink on their eyelashes. And if you were to understand the torturous life of the fur, like minks and rabbits and raccoons and other animals, the lives that they're living just so a person can put some mink on their eyelashes to make their eyelashes look more full and thick and beautiful. I mean, if you could watch some videos of, sometimes these animals are skinned alive.
Right.
They're still alive after their skin has been removed. And it's some of the most barbarous things I've ever seen.
Same. It is the most barbarous thing I've ever seen.
And it's just
It haunts you.
unbelievable. And it does haunt you. I mean, it's almost like you can't get out of your head just so someone can have eyelashes.
It's like worse than the worst horror movie you've ever seen.
No, it is. And it's for real.
Yeah.
Just so you can...
Completely unnecessary as well.
Completely unnecessary. And yet people are doing this. So think about your decisions when you think you need to get mink eyelashes.
And there are synthetic ones.
Yeah.
There are
It's very
synthetic
easy
ones.
to make synthetic eyelashes. I mean,
Right.
Yeah. Now, Salt makes the point, I thought it would be good for us to address, I think near the beginning of the chapter, where he says that wool, he says that wool is an exception when it comes to using animals for fashion because it can be taken without injury to the animal. And I would say that was definitely my impression growing up. And I have recently actually seen a sheep who lives on a sanctuary and is treated very well, getting sheared, I think is the right term.
yes.
And the sheep was currently under this very heavy looking load of wool. And the person shearing this sheep was being very gentle and taking her time and comforting the animal. And the animal seemed very at peace going through the situation. And when she finally lifts this heavy blanket of wool off of the sheep, he like wags his tail and nuzzles her and seems really happy. So it's certainly possible to remove wool from an animal.
When it's in their best interest.
Yeah, when it's in their best interest and it's done with kindness and with compassion. However, in the wool industry, that is not the case.
But real side, how did it become in their best interest?
I mean, it's just, like the thing is, before we actually bred them to have so much wool that they can't even just function without being sheared, they didn't need to be sheared. Like it wasn't, I mean, it was, I guess, a while ago, but it wasn't something that needed to happen. But because we've bred them so that this is like, there's just the most, like the biggest amount of product possible to use, they literally need to be. And also their skin has been, like their skin is also, they've been bred to have more skin so that they have these weird flaps on them so that they have more wool.
So more surface
and
for
so
more
they
wool.
have, and when they're sheared, they go so fast. The people that sometimes they will cut ears, they will cut the skin, they will cut tails off in the process because they're paid by the like just by one sheep, like by the sheep basically. And so they will have these cuts, and these cuts get infected, attract flies, and that's why people in the industry will use mulesing, which is basically a practice of cutting the skin of their basically bottom. I don't really remember the logic behind it. It's basically some tactic so that flies don't lay their eggs in the wounds in the flaps of the sheep. It's obviously not used in sanctuaries.
The little bit I've read, it's like it's right around their rear end.
Yes.
So it's probably the least sanitary part of the animal. Then they have all this skin and wool there, and so they just snip off some of the skin in that
without
area,
anesthesia.
right? Just so that flies aren't going in there and laying eggs and
but I don't really understand.
Yeah.
Anyways, but they do that, and obviously in sanctuaries they don't do that.
And I think you mentioned earlier is that the merino wool sheep.
that species of sheep.
Species. So are all the socks that we love to buy made out of merino wool? These are the sheep that are getting their backsides cut, the skin.
And of course they are sent to slaughter at the end. Whereas in sanctuaries, the whole point is to do that for their best interest because it is better for them. if they use the wool, like they just basically use it for something else, but it's not like to make money off of this animal and to actually use them and send them to slaughter afterwards. You know, it is actually in the best interest of that.
Right.
So with an eye towards animals' rights, making the most humane and compassionate choices we can as we shop for fashion, as we shop for clothing. So, we definitely try to avoid fur, including mink eyelashes, leather, which is not just a byproduct of the beef industry. It is its own industry, and there are really toxic chemicals used in the industrial leather industry that is not only terrible for the environment and especially the water and the soil, but also for the humans who work in these places. Avoiding wool just because of how cruelly the sheep are often treated in the wool industry.
And sent to slaughter.
And then ultimately sent to slaughter. And then also silk and some types of satin, which are made from silk as well. Chapter 7, experimental torture. So he's left the science lab treatment of animals for the very end of the book. And unfortunately, I don't know that much has changed in this arena. He starts out by talking about something that we have discussed on this show before, which is the bias that scientists have, the field of science has. Primarily, we blame René Descartes for kind of being the father of vivisection, which, if you don't know, is just experimenting on an animal while they're still living. And I don't think that anesthesia is ever part of that picture. It's just experimenting on animals while they're alive. And Descartes would laugh at his assistants when they would get upset about the animal who was obviously suffering and say, they're just machines. They can't feel. They can't think. You're silly if you're getting upset about it.
Right.
So he says, but the fact that vivisection is not, as some of its opponents would appear to regard it, a portentous, unaccountable phenomenon, but rather the logical outcome of a certain ill-balanced habit of mind, does not in any way detract from its intellectual and moral loathsomeness. It is idle to spend a single moment in advocating the rights of the lower animals if such rights do not include a total and unqualified exemption from the awful tortures of vivisection, from the doom of being slowly and mercilessly dismembered or flayed or baked alive or infected with some deadly virus or subjected to any of the numerous modes of torture inflicted by the scientific inquisition.
Wow.
So he talks about how science has no real reverence for the individual animal that they're studying. He talks about how science, the only way it can study an organism is by killing it, instead of just studying it in its natural environment. It's kind of the bias to kill it and then study it. He kind of makes his point mostly, his argument rests on the moral idea that animals cannot consent to this. And we know it's inhumane because we would never dream of doing this to humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, in human history, this has been done to humans.
Yes.
And we look at it as absolutely horrific that it was done to African Americans in this country. It was done to the Jews during the Holocaust. The doctors would perform experiments on, horrific experiments on the Jews. So he says, he says, it's worth noting that no human volunteer has as yet come forward to die under the hands of the vivisector. Regardless of our love of advancement and human knowledge and finding cures for diseases and, whatever we argue, we don't think it's worth it while to do it to humans.
Right.
So
why are we doing it to innocent animals?
There are consenting individuals like humans that would that actually agree. And I mean, I would think that often is because they have something to benefit from it, like they're suffering from the condition themselves.
So you're talking about people who would volunteer for like a trial
Yes,
drug.
in that sense, yeah, not
Yeah.
like vivisection or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
But like it makes sense when you think about it. Like, why would you take a being that's healthy and just minding their own business to and just make them unhealthy, sick, just cut them open or whatever, torment them, use them to benefit you when it's not going to benefit them, instead of like doing it in a way that's like, you know, like being experimented on yourself in a way, of course, that is, you know, consensual and that's not going to be bad for you, but you're the one benefiting from it or something,
Right.
you know.
No, and I think we can learn from experimentation that is not violent or that is not taking advantage of animals or hurting anyone or any suffering. And, you know, interestingly, you know, the Physicians Committee on Responsible Medicine, you know, they keep track of some of the science that is being done that is science that is using animals in cruel and unusual ways. Let's put it that way. And most recently, Elon Musk, he has a company called Neuralink. And reading from the Physician Committee's website, it says, since 2017, Elon Musk company Neuralink has subjected animals, including monkeys, pigs, rats, and sheep, to invasive, often deadly brain experiments. Through 2020, the company paid $1.4 million to the University of California, Davis to use its facilities where experimenters removed portions of monkey skulls to implant electrodes in the animals' brains as part of Neuralink's development of a brain-machine interface. Only in 2020, following a public records lawsuit by the Physicians Committee, did the troubling details of these experiments begin to come to light. The company is still conducting experiments on animals in its facilities in California and Texas. And so, yeah, when you just think about that, all the good that even, let's be honest, Elon Musk is doing through many of his companies, this is probably unnecessary, to say the least. And I think the Physicians Committee has shown through research and through journal and through evidence that there are other ways that humans can benefit from experimentation that don't include suffering.
Yeah. Like I'm reading one of their emails that says, it's simple. Neuralink should use more effective, human relevant and non-animal methods to advance their brain-computer interface research. There's no reason for Elon Musk's science experiments to hurt animals. Animals deserve better. They should not be abused in the name of research. What I love about this is the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They do so much good work in terms of educating people on nutrition, plant-based nutrition, on how you could fight chronic diseases by what you put in your mouth, which that in itself is a rarity among physicians to even talk about nutrition. So not only do they, not just stop there at the nutrition level and educating humans, but they use their scientific knowledge and their position as physicians to stand up against animal cruelty within, medical research.
Right.
So I love that. I love that they're doing that.
No, and it sounds like that they're trying to eliminate all suffering, human suffering, unnecessary suffering through diet and disease, and suffering to our fellow Earthlings. So yeah, this has been an amazing book, right?
Yeah, totally amazing. And we've done it. We've reached the last chapter of Animals' Rights Considered in Relation to Social Progress by Henry S. Salt.
You can find it at Gutenberg.org,
Yes.
I believe. Yeah,
Gutenberg.
It's online for free. It's in the public domain.
Yes, published in 1892, reprinted in 1922. So his last chapter is just kind of a conclusion chapter. I think it's titled Lines of Reform. So basically he's kind of trying to give us a path forward for animals' rights. And he lays out basically two of those paths that work together. The first one being education, which is honestly the purpose of this podcast, is to help educate on the subject of animals' rights. The second path is that of the legal system, passing laws that continue to take animals' rights into consideration, which is something that, there are whole legal firms around the country and around the world that specialize in this kind of work.
And getting them to personhood status.
Yes, actually seeing them in the eyes of the law as being a non-human person.
And not property.
Yeah. So one thing that I did want to say before we end is he makes the point of saying we cannot fool ourselves that being cruel to animals is not also detrimental to our humanity. And I really appreciate that point, that when we're cruel to anyone, it actually diminishes our own humanity.
Yeah.
And there's this really amazing quote that I don't know who wrote it. Ask yourself this one question. When the end comes, will there be less suffering in the world because you lived or because you died?
Yeah, that's an awesome quote. I mean, it's inspirational. Like, can I minimize the amount of suffering in the world through my life?
Or am I increasing it?
Or am I actually, supporting it and increasing it, or turning a blind eye to it? So
Yeah. And going vegan is one of the most effective things you can do to eliminate suffering in this world.
And, a vegan saves between 30 to 600 lives per year just by not adding to the demand, not breeding animals into existence because.
And also
fell for
yourself.
Yeah, of course.
mm-hmm.
By eating a plant-based diet.
And the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're helping the environment. It's like a three-prong approach. You're helping the environment, you're helping eliminate suffering, and also your own health. You're preventing future diseases through eating a plant-based diet. So, yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, and we
Thank
appreciate
you.
your time.
And live
Yeah.
vegan.
Yeah.